They say some storms are born, not made. Yours didn't arrive with lightning, it was the lightning, tearing through the clouds, screaming before it even hit the ground. The villagers didn't witness a birth that night. They survived an arrival. Now, before we begin this wild ride through the frost-bitten chaos of one very particular soul, do me a favor, if this kind of storytelling grips your brain and rattles your spine, hit that follow or subscribe button. And if you're watching from somewhere cold, warm, upside down, or in the middle of nowhere, drop a comment below with your location and the time. I love knowing where this strange little tribe is tuning in from. Alright, breathe out, lean back, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background hum, and let's wander back, way back. You weren't born in a cradle of peace. Oh no, you came out fighting, kicked the air, cried like a wolf caught in a thunderstorm. The midwife nearly dropped you, not out of clumsiness, but from sheer force of sound. You screeched like Odin himself had yanked your soul into this realm too early, and you were mad about it. The local seer muttered something about the mark of the fire born, while your grandmother just dunked you in snow and said, "He'll live." Probably. You didn't so much cry as roar. You didn't sleep, you glared at the ceiling with the intensity of someone plotting revenge. The chickens refused to roost near your crib. A dog peed itself the first time it heard you hiccup. The village elders kept their distance. Something about your eyes made people uneasy. Not evil, just a bit too awake. Like you knew something you shouldn't. At 3 months old, you growled at a goat. It ran. At 9 months, you headbutted a wooden spoon out of your father's hand. He never got it back. By the time you could crawl, you were already a demolition project in motion. You learned to walk by charging at walls. The walls eventually learned to move. The neighbors started calling you the Little Tempest. Your mother called you Havoc, with a strangely affectionate sigh. Your father just quietly patched up whatever you broke, mumbling something about warrior spirit while icing his bruises. While other children snuggled with soft wool dolls, you gnawed on bones. Not animal bones, furniture. You bit a chair leg clean off before your first birthday. People stopped trying to hug you after a string of headbutts left a trail of bandaged noses and hurt feelings. One visiting merchant claimed he saw your eyes flash red during a tantrum. He doesn't visit anymore. At 2 years old, you were banned from the livestock pen. You tried to ride a cow, backwards, into the river. You screamed something about glory the whole way down. By the time you could form full sentences, your favorite word was again. After every fall, every crash, every failed leap from rooftop to haystack, you demanded a repeat. No lesson learned. Just more momentum. When the other kids started practicing with wooden swords, you refused. Not out of fear, because wood didn't scream when it snapped. You started swinging around a half-broken table leg you called crack skull. You carried it everywhere, even to bed. Your parents gave up arguing with you. They tried hiding it once. You cried so loud the shaman showed up thinking it was a spiritual attack. He left with ringing ears and a new limp. By age 4, you'd already been accused of possessing either a dark spirit or extreme enthusiasm. Probably both. You challenged a wild turkey to a duel and lost. 2 days later, you showed up with feathers braided into your hair and claimed victory anyway. No one could prove otherwise. The turkey hasn't been seen since. Your reputation spread like wildfire. Loud, some said. Unruly, others whispered. Clearly part troll, muttered a man who was promptly tackled into a pile of firewood when you overheard. That was the first and last time anyone underestimated your hearing. You didn't seek chaos, it followed you like a shadow you refused to acknowledge. You didn't mean to destroy the family well's pulley system, you just thought it was training for your arms. You didn't intend to cause a minor landslide during berry picking, you were testing rock loyalty. By the time you were 6, the village had adapted. People reinforced their doors. Animals were locked up early. Blacksmiths doubled their iron orders just to patch what you broke during your adventures. One local girl gifted you a flower crown once. You ate it. She married someone else the next spring. Still, you weren't evil. You weren't mean. Just intense. Like a fire that hadn't figured out what it wanted to burn yet. You smiled exactly 3 times, and every time, someone got nervous. Not because the smile was wrong, it was just unfamiliar. The fourth time you smiled, a pig fainted. You had no friends your age. Most kids were either terrified or in recovery. Except one, a scruffy, lopsided sheepdog with one good ear and the patience of a snow-covered rock. You named him Bristle. He followed you everywhere, often rescuing you from your own bold stupidity. Once, he dragged you out of a freezing stream after you tried to wrestle an eel. Another time, he barked so loud that your mother found you trying to jump off the roof, just to see if the wind liked you. You smelled like smoke and dirt, and something no one could identify. Maybe destiny. You built your first fortress out of laundry, stolen meat bones, and leftover firewood. It collapsed within an hour, but not before you declared war on a nearby anthill. You lost, but the ants never recovered either. Once, during a quiet winter morning, a monk passed through the village. He saw you practicing with your stick, screaming at the sky, face painted with berry juice. He asked if you needed salvation. You challenged him to single combat. He left before breakfast. You weren't allowed near the shrine after that. Too much spirit, said the priest. Too little sense, muttered your aunt. But your grandmother? She looked at you, covered in bruises and pride, and said, "He's not broken, he's just not finished." And that stuck. Because deep down everyone knew you weren't just chaos in a child's body. You were something else. Something loud, dangerous, weirdly poetic, and impossible to ignore. You weren't destined for a calm life of fishnets and firewood. No, you were barreling towards something larger. You were not born to fit in. You were born to shake the mountains. And even at age 7, that truth was as clear as the bite marks on the village's only drinking horn. By the time you hit 8, no one in the village was asking, "What's wrong with him?" anymore. They were asking, "Can we aim him at something dangerous, preferably far away?" You weren't so much growing up as growing sharper, like a storm perfecting its lightning bolts. There was something in the way you glared at thunder like you were daring the sky to speak first. Something in how you didn't run, you charged. Through puddles, through fences, through walls that had absolutely no quarrel with you. You devoured food like it owed you money. Even in midsummer, you ate as though winter was already banging on the door. At one feast, you polished off half a tray of boiled eggs, a chunk of smoked trout, someone's unattended biscuit, and without realizing part of a wooden centerpiece that had vaguely resembled a goat. By the time anyone noticed, you were gnawing on a serving spoon and humming what might have been a battle chant. Your body by now was a walking mural of bruises, scrapes, and tiny wooden splinters. The local healer had stopped asking what happened. She just gave you a look, muttered, "Not again," and patted you like a horse that couldn't be tamed. Her new advice was simply, "Next time, aim for something squishy." You had started to develop a laugh, not a happy giggle or a child's chuckle, but a full-throated, back-of-the-throat, "Did you hear that crack? That was my arm, kind of laugh. You once slipped off a roof, crash-landed into a barrel of apples, crushed 2 crates of onions, and sprained your wrist. You said it was the best day of your life. Your parents said nothing. They just quietly reinforced the roof and the barrel. You started carrying around sticks the size of small canoe paddles, giving them terrifying names like Skullspanker and Stick of Destiny's Misfortune. You attacked trees, not pretended to. You actually attacked them, and some trees lost. Bark chipped off like it owed you blood. Your parents gave up on chores, completely. Every effort to teach you patience ended with something catching fire. Once it was a bench, once it was your own pants. You no longer wore wool leggings. They were deemed too flammable for your lifestyle. The village elders didn't speak about you in concerned tones anymore. Now they whispered with a mix of fascination and fear. Some said you'd been marked by the old gods. Others swore it was all the goat milk. But no one doubted anymore this wasn't just mischief or energy. You weren't a child. You were a phenomenon. Something that made wolves back away and birds lift off nervously when you walked by. You had become the kind of tale parents whispered to rowdy children. "Sleep now, or the wild one will come, shirtless and screaming." And still, your journey hadn't even begun. When you turned 10, someone no one is quite sure who decided it was time for formal training. Not that anyone wanted to do the training. Most volunteers pretended to lose interest once they saw you wrestle a tree stump and shout, "Do you yield?" Eventually, a one-eyed ex-raider named Hrothgar the Limp agreed. Out of boredom? Revenge? A bet gone wrong? Who knows? Hrothgar had survived more battles than most people had arguments, and he figured you might be fun to train, or at least entertaining to watch crash into things. His training style was simple. He stood 20 paces away and shouted things like, "Swing with your arms, not your teeth," or "Stop yelling at the axe, it's not your enemy." He didn't correct your form because you didn't have one. You had brute force and ambition. That was it. You were handed a training axe so dull it could have been used to spread butter. You looked at it, shrugged, and tried sharpening it on a nearby boulder. The boulder cracked. The axe? Still dull. Hrothgar upgraded you the next day out of fear for the rocks. When he gave you a heavier axe, you thanked him by immediately swinging it in mid-conversation, knocking his drinking horn directly into a fire pit. He didn't yell. He just nodded. Good instincts. Other boys your age trained with posture, drills, and coordination. You trained like a wolf in a tumble dryer. Hay bales were flattened. Chickens ran screaming. Straw dummies were reduced to confetti. You weren't mastering technique. You were discovering the fine art of beautiful chaos. A fighting style entirely based on unpredictable lunges and loud declarations of imaginary grudges. Then came wrestling, the Norse staple of strength, respect, and humility. Your first match ended with you picking up a boy named Rurik and suplexing him into a puddle so hard he spoke only in vowels for a week. You offered him your hand and said, "That was fun." He quietly moved to another village. No one gave you books. No one handed out scrolls. But everyone around you slowly realized you weren't being raised. You were being forged, like a weapon made of noise and momentum. No longer referred to as a child, people began calling you the Project, or Hrothgar's living headache. Hrothgar himself admitted, after some ale, that he hadn't seen this much raw, directionless fury since the time he headbutted a bishop during a raid, and lost. That bishop apparently still limps. The only part of training you actually enjoyed was battle chanting. Not because you liked the rhythm, but because it gave you permission to yell at full volume without being told to go outside. You didn't care about timing. You didn't learn footwork. You mastered the art of sheer presence, the kind of energy that makes seasoned warriors flinch slightly when you run past. Unpredictability became your superpower. No one knew what you were going to do next, not even you. And that terrified everyone, just enough for it to start working. And then, at 12, the whispers got louder. You were no longer that boy. You were the force, the storm, the one who tackled a boar and rode it into the river. 3 neighboring villages had stories about you. One farmer swore his scarecrow retired the day you walked by and growled at it. That's when the rite of passage was whispered into motion. They called it the bare chest trial. No one explained what it meant. There were no instructions, no songs, no ceremonies. One cold morning, Hrothgar appeared in your doorway, handed you a bucket of goat blood, and said, "You'll be needing this." This did not alarm you. It thrilled you. Your eyes widened. You started humming again. You might have even drooled a little. Then, without a word, they led you deep into the forest. The air was thick with fog. Twigs cracked like bones underfoot. Birds went silent. And there, around a fire blazing high in the icy clearing, stood 5 massive men, shirtless, scarred, eyes glowing with a kind of madness that didn't come from wine or war but from something older. Something wilder. They didn't speak. They just turned to face you. And you knew this was not just about strength. This was about becoming. Becoming the thing that made thunder jealous. Becoming the tale that warriors whispered to each other before a raid. Becoming something no one could control and nothing could break. So you stepped forward, holding your bucket, chest bare, eyes wild, and the forest held its breath. They stand in the circle like haunted, statuesque, unsmiling, and possibly muttering to spirits only they can hear. One of them does all 3 at once. Their heads tilt slightly toward you, that uniquely terrifying Viking gesture that says, "Welcome, but also behave." It's less a greeting, more a quiet threat soaked in tradition. The ritual begins with red-stained fingers dragging ancient runes across your chest, using the goat blood like it's war paint mixed with prophecy. No one tells you what the symbols mean. Could be courage. Could be caution. Do not approach. You're too polite to ask, and too nervous to sneeze. You have a feeling any sudden movement might result in a spiritual accident. Then they place it on you, the bare skin. Not bare as in empty, bare as in pysit. It used to be one. Huge, heavy, and very much still smelling like it just lost a fight with a volcano. They drape it over your shoulders like some hairy crown of destiny. No one says if the bear died honorably in battle or just gave up when it saw you coming. Either way, it fits like fate. The fire pops as the elder warriors begin to growl, not sing, not chant, but grunt in what might be Old Norse or just very committed throat clearing. As the embers dance, you're handed a horn of something that might be fermented or cursed. It burns all the way down, leaving your spine questioning its life choices. Your eyebrows twitch. Your ears try to leave. And then the madness begins. They shout, "Become the beast." So you do. Kind of. What happens next isn't dancing. It's flailing mixed with war cries and interpretive stomping. You throw your arms like you're attacking invisible bees, spin like a thunder god with vertigo, and howl like a banshee auditioning for an opera. You kick ash into the air and narrowly avoid face-planting into the sacred fire. No one stops you. Technically, no one told you not to. The older berserkers seem satisfied. You are then gifted a name. It's said aloud, booming, echoing through the trees. It could be Fangheart, or Elk Screamer, or possibly that one. You're dizzy and mildly hallucinating, but you nod with pride anyway. You are now, officially, a berserker in training. And that should make your enemies nervous. Because you now wear the fur. And worse, you're learning how to growl. As a newly minted junior berserker smelling like thunder and raw wilderness, your education now shifts to something deeply sacred, pre-battle rituals. These, surprisingly, center around mushrooms. Not the tasty kind, not the kind you saute. These are the kind that whisper at you, the kind that challenge your understanding of walls. No one offers much explanation. One elder simply presses a fistful into your hand and says, "Chew fast." So you chew, fast. They taste like regret, like moss, dirt, and something your soul wasn't ready for. Minutes later, your vision begins humming. The fire develops a personality. Someone hiccups nearby, and it echoes like a war drum. The earth spins, but you're no longer sure which way is down. Perfect. Welcome to what they call berserker trance. This isn't meditation. This is a spiritual cage match inside your skull. The goal? Unlock the beast within. Yours turns out to be a deeply confused elk, who thinks everything is a threat and nothing is furniture. Still, you embrace it. You feel fire in your veins. You start growling at your own shadow. You flex like you're trying to punch thunder. A straw dummy is dragged into the clearing. You do not wait. You pounce like a feral cat in tax season. You tackle it, bite the neck, roll over it twice, and roar so loudly a nearby squirrel passes out. The elders grunt in agreement. One rasps, "He's got it." Side effects? Oh yes, time becomes soup. You're not sure if you've been yelling for 12 seconds or a full Norse moon cycle. You punch a shadow. It dodges. You accuse a tree of betrayal. You lose a philosophical argument with your own boots. Eventually your body decides enough is enough and you collapse headfirst into a barrel of fish. The fish are unbothered. You, however, smell like pickled despair for a week. Still, the ritual is deemed successful. Not all berserkers use mushrooms. Some fast. Others stare into fire until their memories melt. A few simply harness pure, unreleased childhood trauma and unresolved grudges. You, though? You choose mushrooms. You call it brain lightning. No one corrects you. Because the truth is simple. This isn't about rage. It's about becoming more than human. Less person. More force of nature. The kind of presence that makes enemies tremble before you lift a finger. The kind of warrior who doesn't retreat. Not because of valor, but because you forgot which way is back. And this, somehow, makes you both terrifying and extremely difficult to babysit. You're no longer training to fight, you're training to unhinge. And then the day arrives. Your first real battle. No more practice. No more straw mannequins. No more pretend roars at laundry lines. This is it. The moment where the storm stops circling and finally hits. You wake on battle day with a thought so clear it hums. Violence sounds nice today. You don't eat breakfast. Not out of nerves, but because you crushed your bread and cheese under a celebratory fist pump. Your stomach shrugs. Instead, you take the ritual mushroom nibble without hesitation. At this point, your digestive system considers it part of your identity. Then comes the war dance. It's not really choreography, more like group chaos with rhythm. Everyone jumps, screams, bangs weapons together and glares into the sky. You're swinging your axe like it's offended you personally. Someone has to remind you that teammates are not in fact the enemy. You grunt an apology and headbutt a helmet instead. This is seen as emotional growth. As the enemy appears on the horizon, the air changes. The world seems to narrow. Your breathing gets deeper. You hear screaming, it might be yours, it might not. Doesn't matter. You grip your axe so hard it audibly complains. Your eyes roll just slightly back, just enough to unsettle the weak-hearted and impress the veterans. Hrothgar, watching from the edge, leans toward another warrior and mutters, "He's ready." And then frenzy. You don't walk. You don't run. You charge. Your legs forget how to walk like a person, and remember only how to move like a thunderclap. You don't so much attack as erupt. You leap, twist, yell, swing half wildfire, half wild guess. You have the grace of a panicked walrus falling off a longship, but the destructive power of a drunk storm god with something to prove. Pain tries to check in, and you deny entry. An arrow grazes your side. You bite a nearby tree out of spite. A spear whooshes past your ribs. You respond by launching a high kick directly into the spear carrier's knee like a furious goat with acrobatics training. You crash into two warriors, flatten them, and keep charging before you even process who they were. You are no longer a boy. You are a berserker. And not just any berserker, you are the midnight tale other Vikings whisper when the wind howls wrong. This is Berserker Gang, a state of pure, primal chaos where the body runs on rage, muscle memory, and the absolute abandonment of common sense. Scholars might call it spiritual possession. Healers may call it dissociative madness. You just call it fun. You scream until your throat burns like it's being forged. You swing until your arms forget they're attached to a skeleton. You become unreachable. Not even your war brothers dare speak your name mid-frenzy. One brave soul taps your shoulder gently with his shield to signal, "Battle's over." You spin around and hurl a log at him. He dodges and smiles. A true compliment. When the fog lifts and the dust settles, you're still standing barely. Your skin wears blood and bruises like ceremony paint. A piece of someone's helmet is stuck in your fur cloak. No one claps. They don't need to. They just stare. You blink once, twice, and say, "Nice warm-up." You're not training anymore. You're not the boy who yells. You are now an official, battle-baptized berserker. Odin help whoever faces you next. You may also have noticed, during these first few glorious rampages, a rather critical detail. You're barely wearing anything. While the rest of your warband stomps onto the battlefield in layers of chainmail, iron plates, hardened leather, and brooding expressions, you arrive dressed in enthusiasm and last night's dried sweat. Maybe, if you're feeling fancy, you wrap a strip of leather around your wrist. For style, not for safety. Why don't berserkers wear armor? Because armor is for people who plan on being hit. Your approach is different. Intimidate them until they drop their weapons or forget how to use them. If you actually get struck, that's a you problem. And you will bring it up at every feast for the next 10 years. Loudly. There's another reason to freedom of movement. Armor restricts. It clanks. It slows the flail. And berserker combat? It's 80% wild flailing, 10% growling, and 10% spontaneous cartwheels through thorn bushes on fire. Try doing that in a helmet. You'll look like a confused beetle. What you do wear is your sacred bear hide. The thing smells like cooked sorrow and angry rain clouds. But it matters. Some claim it's enchanted absorbing the fear of enemies, shielding your heart from steel, or summoning the spirits of ancient warriors. Mostly it just absorbs sweat and makes you look like a terrifying wilderness-themed carpet. But that's the point. You're not supposed to look human. You're supposed to look like something carved from an old saga and dragged out of the forest to collect overdue revenge. Without armor, your body becomes your armor. You build layers of skin calluses where others use shields. Your scars become a second language. Your bruises form their own runes. And if you're especially committed, you carve a wolf tattoo into your chest using burnt ash, a stick, and absolutely zero planning. Yes, it hurts. Getting stabbed always does. But to you, pain is just life's way of asking, "Still here?" You once got skewered in the thigh and didn't notice until someone politely pointed out you were leaking. You thanked them, then threw a rock at the guy who stabbed you. People may mock your naked fury until they see you demolish 3 armed warriors with a soup ladle and a primal screech. Then they start mocking you from far away. Because armor is for the careful. You have madness, and fur, and zero concern for the consequences of your decisions. But here's something no one tells outsiders about going berserk. When the fog sets in, everything starts looking very stab-worthy. You may intend to focus. You may go into battle thinking, "Today I will only maim designated enemies." And that lasts exactly 4 seconds. Then the mushrooms whisper, the blood boils, and your vision starts to shimmer like reality is poorly sewn together. Suddenly, your war brothers look a little too twitchy, a little too punchable. Your first mishap is minor. You try to high-five your shield brother except you forget you're holding your axe. You split his helmet. He laughs. It happens. By the 3rd raid, things get weird. You mistake a braided beard for a Viking snake. You scream, "Witchery!" and attempt to slap the evil off his chin. It's not well received. During one chaotic brawl, you whip your helmet at someone shouting your name. It's your cousin. He was calling you to dinner. You both laugh about it later. Kind of. No one's mad. Because you're not a warrior. You're a berserker. Which is basically a very muscular tornado with impulse control issues. Berserkers are like extremely aggressive puppies. They mean well, but sometimes they bite the table. At one point, you even try to apologize mid-frenzy. You body slam into a fellow warrior, pause, give a grunty thumbs up, and stagger away. He nods respectfully from the dirt. Eventually, the warband learns to adapt. One guy starts wearing a red sash, so you remember not to launch him into a bush. You forget anyway. Another sticks close behind you and uses you as a walking battering ram. Smart. One particularly clever soul discovers that yelling your name mid-fight scrambles your brain just enough to redirect your fury elsewhere. It works. You chase a tree for 20 minutes. Occasionally, someone dares suggest tying a bell around your neck. Like a warning system. Like a goat. These people are wisely ignored. You're not a goat, you just fight like one on a sugar rush. By now, your warband has developed a kind of method around your madness. If you sprint toward the wrong enemy camp, they wait patiently. If you charge a storage tent, they give you a few minutes to roar at it, then casually set it on fire afterward, so you'll feel victorious. It's a system. A ridiculous, oddly effective system. And despite all the injuries, most of them yours, some of them everyone else's, nobody wants to fight without you. Because yes, you occasionally bite ankles and uppercut chickens, but you also shatter enemy morale the moment your bare feet hit the dirt. You don't look like a soldier. You look like the reason soldiers quit. You are a storm. And sure, sometimes storms sink friendly ships, but they also win wars. Your name carries weight now. Not admiration. Exactly more like a haunted awareness. Across the coast, in taverns and longhouses, you're known. The twitchy one. The one who growled at a candle. The boy who allegedly ate a shield. No one knows if that last story is true. You certainly don't clarify. Why ruin a good myth? In fact, myth is your greatest weapon. See, stories move faster than warriors. Before you arrive, livestock gets hidden, fences are double-checked, and children are told bedtime tales that include your name and a warning about running near the lake. You once flipped 3 tables at a village feast because you mistook the laughter for an ambush. Someone handed you a roasted leg of lamb to distract you. It worked, barely. On the battlefield, your presence is concerning. You're never dressed for war. You're shirtless, barefoot, usually bleeding from somewhere unclear. Your eyes don't say strategy. They say, point me at something that needs to be screamed at. This is your greatest strength, psychological warfare. No armor, no polish. Just unpredictability, and a gaze that suggests you've fought ghosts before and won. Enemies hesitate. They don't see a warrior. They see a problem they don't want to have. But reputation has consequences. After every skirmish, the cleanup begins. You often wake up groaning under a tree, covered in moss, blood, not always yours, and holding a random object like a bucket, or a chicken leg, or a tree branch you've named Victory. A local priest once offered to say a prayer. You grunted. He took it as a warning and backed away with great speed. You've broken 3 ships. Accidentally. Twice by stepping where wood wasn't meant to be stepped. You once spooked a diplomat by growling during a peace talk. You once tried to arm wrestle a statue. The statue technically won, but you argue it cheated. The warband starts assigning a handler, a kind of post-battle wrangler. Their job is to calm you down, lead you away from anything flammable, and gently remind you that tents are not enemies unless they move. You usually respond with a head nod and then immediately punch the ground. Not out of anger, just habit. And still, your legend blooms. The skalds, those poetic Viking musicians with a love for exaggerated truth, start writing songs about you. They're usually in minor keys. One names you the howling hammer of Frostmere. You like it. You don't remember where Frostmere is. You assume you broke it. You are no longer just a berserker. You are a rumour with a pulse. A moving warning sign with really strong shoulders and absolutely no brakes. And then, something unthinkable happens. You fall in love. No one plans this, least of all berserkers. Feelings are strange, blurry, impossible to yell at, and unreasonably good at dodging axes. But love doesn't care what kind of fur you wear. She's a blacksmith's daughter, broad shoulders, suspicious eyes, always holding something heavy and metal. She smells like iron and old fire. She looks at you like you're a question she didn't ask but now has to solve. You find this deeply attractive. She for some reason finds you interesting. Dangerous, she calls you, but sometimes amusing. It's unclear if she's complimenting you or planning to weaponize you. Either way, you're invested. Your courtship begins in the traditional Viking way. You break her father's anvil. You claim you were testing its emotional resilience. She storms outside, eyes full of thunder. You, in your purest form of honesty, offer to duel the ghost of the anvil as penance. She laughs, then throws a horseshoe at your head. Love. You try to impress her the only way you know. Dramatic displays of questionable strength. You lift a boulder. You flex. You carry a goat over your shoulder while telling her it's for training. She watches, expression unreadable, then calmly returns to hammering iron. Eventually she agrees to go for a walk with you. Not because she's charmed, because she'd rather keep you in sight than leave you unsupervised. Conversation is awkward. You don't know what to say, so you just carry a tree branch the entire time, like a romantic prop. She doesn't ask about it. That's how you know she's special. Your berserker brothers are confused. Isn't love a weakness? One mutters. You respond, she gives me a reason not to headbutt tents anymore. He stares. That sounds like discipline? You don't reply. You're already carving her initials into your skin with a burnt stick. Eventually, she gives you a gift. A necklace. Iron. Simple. Slightly sharp like her. You never take it off. Even during raids. Especially during raids. When someone asks why, you grunt, "It protects me." It's sweet. It's also terrifying. You don't understand feelings, not really. But you understand loyalty. She fixes your armorless gear. You bring her weird-looking bones and shiny rocks. It's working. There are challenges. You once tried to serenade her by howling at the moon until your voice cracked. You howled at the moon like it owed you rent. She told you to stop. You howled louder. You spent the next 3 nights sleeping outside, wrapped in damp fur and stubborn pride. She didn't leave. And in berserker terms, that's a wedding proposal. Sure, you're chaos given muscle, but even hurricanes like a little thunderous romance. After bloodshed comes the Viking version of therapy: feasting, food, fire, singing, headbutting. For most warriors, it's celebration. For you, it's a high-stakes game of how long before I throw something. You're never on time. First, someone has to scrub the battlefield off your skin. You usually enter shirtless, limping, bruised, possibly barefoot, often holding something bizarre and not entirely food. One time, it was a squirrel. No one ate it. It still made it into the songs. That squirrel has fans now. Feasts begin with a toast. You interpret this as drink everything not nailed down. Mead, ale, questionable liquids. You once drank lamp oil by mistake. Everyone just watched. Later, you lit a torch with your breath. The village children still reenact that moment. Then comes the foodball legs, fish cakes, pickled regret, mystery stew. You approach the table like it insulted your family. You don't eat so much as declare dominance over your plate. You once consumed 5 boiled eggs in 60 seconds and declared a blood feud with a cabbage. But your stomach has limits. This leads to the infamous Great Hall incident. It involved beans, loud music, celebratory chanting, and one poorly timed battle roar that turned into something else entirely. The sound echoed like destiny. You pretended it didn't happen. Everyone else tried too. One man sobbed into his porridge. Then there's the other kind of post-feast ritual: brawling. Because what do you get when you mix swords, exhaustion, fermented bravery, and personal space issues? Emotional development. You once triggered a full brawl after mishearing someone shout, "Pass the boar," as you smell like boar. You didn't check for context. You flipped a bench, punched a goblet, and tackled a curtain. And still, no one stays mad. Because in their words, you're entertaining. You fight like you mean it. You eat like the world's ending. And one time, your flatulence scared off a pack of wolves. That's value. By night's end, you're curled beneath a table, cradling a ham bone like a newborn, humming a battle hymn with crumbs in your beard. Because berserkers don't just destroy armies. They party like they're tearing down Valhalla. Every fearsome berserker has one tale they pretend never happened. Yours? The sheep incident. It began like any other raid. Longship, coastline, bloodlust. You were high on mushrooms and ambition, wearing your bear pelt backwards because someone said it made you look taller. No one argued. No one wanted to die. The target? A sleepy-looking village. No guards in sight. No battle cries. Just sheep. Lots of sheep. Most warriors would hesitate. You howled and charged. You sprinted ashore and tackled the nearest wool blur. It bleated in confusion. You declared victory. The rest of your warband followed out of sheer disbelief. You smashed fences. You kicked barrels. You crashed into what looked like a sacred temple turned out to be someone's chicken coop. 5 hens and a rooster named Olaf launched a coordinated defense. You responded by headbutting the air itself. The sky wobbled. Eventually, you burst into a modest hut and smashed a shrine, which turned out to be a kitchen. You ate 2 loaves of bread and an entire candle. You realized it was a candle only after your throat started smoking. You growled. The candle wept. That's when it hit you. This wasn't a village. It was a pasture. Someone's summer pasture. The lone farmer arrived, elderly, holding a rake, looking more annoyed than afraid. You screamed your war cry. He squinted. Then, cool as a snowstorm, hurled a turnip at your face. You recoiled. Raid over. Back at camp, no one spoke. One warrior muttered, We stole a goat." Another said, "We burned a cabbage patch." You shrugged. It looked aggressive. The skalds tried to salvage the tale. They failed. No one bought it. You were now officially the berserker who defeated a flock and lost to produce. You tried to explain. The sheep were looking at me funny. They nodded. They'd heard worse. And still, your legend grew. Because people don't just remember triumph. They remember volume. Years passed. You're older now. Not wise, not calm, just creakier. Your knees snap when you crouch. You need a full minute to raise your axe. But no one flinches anymore. They know you're coming slowly. Like a storm they've got time to prepare for. Your beard is greying. Your scars predict weather. You start telling stories to anyone who'll listen. Children, drunks, dogs. One time you told a 3-hour tale to a barrel. It didn't respond. That's fine. Still one of your best audiences. You've accomplished something few berserkers do. You survived. Most berserkers burn out early. Too many mushrooms, too much rage, not enough spatial awareness. But not you. You didn't survive because you were careful. You survived because no one, not even the gods, could predict what you'd do next. You confused death so many times, it stopped trying. Your name isn't spoken with reverence exactly, but it's spoken loudly. That counts. People describe you as half bear, half wolf, half lunatic. No one brings up the math. They just nod, slowly. You've even passed on your craft. You trained a few younger warriors. One learned how to roar from deep in his belly like a volcano with opinions. Another, you taught how to tackle trees, politely but firmly. A third, you taught to scream, "I am the wind," mid-duel. He now runs a bakery, still screams it while kneading dough. You don't raid anymore. Your last attempt ended when you got stuck in a doorway and shouted, "Ambush!" before blaming the architecture. Now, you guard the village gates like a stubborn hill spirit. You grunt at strangers, stand by fires, glare at clouds just in case. Sometimes someone offers you a mushroom. You sniff it, raise an eyebrow, and mutter, "Not today, illusions." The blacksmith's daughter still, your thunder-hearted companion puts up with you. She rolls her eyes when you growl at thunder. You roll yours when she suggests you wash your cloak. Neither of you listens. That's love. Feral, smoke-scented, mildly deafening love. And so, your story becomes more than war. It becomes presence. Children play berserker by throwing sticks and yelling wildly at fences. Elders watch with misty eyes and mutter, "Reminds me of him." Anytime someone accidentally flips a table or screams at soup, your name is whispered like a blessing or a warning. You won't live forever, but your volume will. When your time finally comes, it's not in battle, not in a blaze of rage, but quietly, under a sky so full of stars it looks like it's remembering you. Your bones grumble with the cold. You growl more than you speak. The fire becomes your best friend. You sit beside it, muttering tales and polishing your old axe with a chunk of beard you sneezed off last week. You've shouted at death too many times to fear it. Once, you even challenged a thunderstorm to a wrestling match, just to impress the afterlife. You lost, but the thunder hasn't been the same since. You're not afraid of going. You're just mildly annoyed it's taking so long. Any day now, you mutter, with a dramatic cough and a casual rock, chew for emphasis. And then, one night, it happens. You don't fall. You just stop moving. Under the stars, wrapped in your tattered bare skin, which still smells like scorched ham and goat decisions. You sigh and whisper your final words into the wind. Tell Valhalla, reinforce the chairs. They say the skies thundered, that a lone wolf howled without knowing why, that someone found your parting message carved into the back of a broken shield. I regret nothing, except that turnip. Your funeral, absolute chaos. They tried to make it solemn, but within 10 minutes, a brawl broke out over whether you once punched a cloud. A goat got loose. The pyre caught fire before the body arrived. You would have loved it. Your war band toasted you with way too much mead. They sang badly and threw your dented helmet into the fjord. It sank like you once did, drunk, trying to outswim a barrel. The village children reenact your life using sticks, yelling, and spontaneous backflips. One of them bit a log. Everyone nodded approvingly. Your spirit? Still very much alive. The skalds, of course, rewrote everything. In their songs, you defeated 20 men with one swing. You seduced a forest spirit with your eyebrows. You conquered a volcano using only bad poetry and an oar. None of it's true. No one corrects them. Because history doesn't care about accuracy. History loves a good story. And your story? Your story was never about victory. It was about velocity, about laughter through blood, about roaring at the wrong time for the right reasons. You weren't just a berserker. You were a phenomenon in human skeena, thunderclap with opinions. And long after your body rests, your legacy keeps rampaging through taverns, memory, and occasionally collapsing fences. Because while every Viking feared death, you made death fear you. Now, when most people picture a Viking, they imagine a blood-soaked brawler with an axe, a wild beard, and enough BO to fell a moose. But what if I told you those fearsome warriors were surprisingly obsessed with hygiene? That's right. Beneath the fur, behind the roar, your average Viking was more well-groomed than most people on a lazy Sunday. You wouldn't expect it from a tribe known for flinging spears and biting helmets. But archaeological digs in Norse graves and settlements don't just turn up swords and shields. They also reveal something much stranger. Combs, razors, tweezers, ear spoons. Yes, ear spoons. Not crude, splintery tools either. These grooming kits were carved from bone or antler, decorated, polished, and often treated like prized possessions. They weren't just utilities, they were fashion statements. Viking Gucci. And this wasn't just the elite. Men and women, warriors and weavers alike, carried grooming kits with the same care you'd give to a blade. To them, being clean wasn't just about health. It was about honor. Because in a world where your reputation could be your sword or your shackle, showing up greasy and matted was an insult to yourself and your ancestors. Looking sharp said, I may decapitate you, but I'll look good doing it. ID. If you imagine a Viking walking into a feaster, even a town hall meeting, looking like a damp pile of moss with legs, think again. While their swords were sharp, their appearances were sharper. In fact, the line between battle-hardened warrior and fashion-forward woodland peacock got blurry real fast. Beards were not just grown, they were oiled. Hair wasn't hacked off with a dagger, it was braided with intent. Tunics? Not drab, vibrant, stitched, styled. These weren't side hobbies. They were Viking declarations. Yes, I just survived 3 days at sea and decapitated a couple invaders, but did you see my beard? Even those at the bottom of the social ladder had access to grooming tools. Not because they were vain, but because unlike later medieval cultures that saw dirt as holy, Vikings saw cleanliness as sexy. Personal upkeep wasn't a luxury, it was a standard. If you wanted to catch the eye of a strong shield maiden or earn status at court, you started with a clean face and a combed mane. The sagas make it clear. Viking beauty was about bright eyes, glossy hair, and spotless skin. Battle scars? Great storytelling. But they wouldn't get you invited to the good seats at a feast if you smelled like boiled seaweed. So, no Vikings weren't mud-smeared maniacs. They were polished, competitive, and weirdly fabulous. They didn't just conquer with blades, they conquered with style. While the rest of medieval Europe debated whether water was the devil's tool or just a disease in liquid form, Norsemen were scrubbing themselves down like it was a weekly tournament. And not just occasionally. Cleanliness was routine. In fact, they had a whole day named after it. Laugardag. Bath Day. Sound familiar? Over time, it evolved into what we now call Saturday. So the next time you're lounging in a robe, streaming shows, and soaking in a tub, you're honoring your inner Viking. You're living your ancestors' truth. Now, bathing in Viking life wasn't just about rinsing off the raid. It was social, spiritual, sometimes even flirtatious. Families would heat water over the hearth and pour it into big wooden tubs. If you were wealthy, you might have a separate bathhouse. If you weren't, the river would do. But skipping bath day? That was not an option. You cleaned yourself. No excuses. And yes, they had soap. Good stuff too. Made from animal fat and ash, it was gritty, alkaline, and scrubbed the battlefield right out of your pores. It wouldn't leave you smelling like lavender, but it got the job done. Some versions were strong enough to bleach hair. Yes, Bleach. That blonde Viking beard you picture? Not always natural. Many Norsemen bleached their hair and beards on purpose centuries before punk rock made it cool. The Vikings did it for hygiene, fashion, and a touch of menace. After all, if you're swinging an axe and glowing like a sun god, people tend to take you seriously. And here's where things get really fun. Their enemies hated this. English monks and chroniclers were scandalized. They wrote angry little rants about how Norsemen bathed daily, combed their hair regularly, and gasp-changed their clothes. One 11th century chronicler blamed Viking grooming habits for their alarming success with Anglo-Saxon women. According to him, Viking invaders were irresistibly clean. Meanwhile, local men were out here smelling like boiled laundry and wondering what went wrong. Bathing wasn't just a guy thing either. Viking women were equally committed to cleanliness and glam. They used hair oils, natural skincare made from herbs and fats, and owned their own grooming kits. Hygiene wasn't a solo act. It was community bonding. People bathed together, socialized, gossiped, flirted. If you happened to catch eyes with a charming stranger through the steam, well, that's a meet cute with historical accuracy. Now, let's talk clothing. If you're picturing Vikings in nothing but grimy pelts stitched together with fish guts, let me stop you right there. That's Hollywood nonsense. Norse clothing was layered, colorful, detailed, and often gorgeous. These weren't cave-dwelling wilderness folk throwing on whatever raccoon fell nearby. Viking garments were planned, styled, worn with pride, and if you showed up to a feast wearing bland beige, someone might hand you a comb and gently ask if your house was under siege. In Viking society, drab was the fashion equivalent of giving up. Let's break it down. Viking men typically wore long-sleeved tunics made of linen or wool, often reaching mid-thigh. These were paired with trousers or fitted leggings, sometimes bandaged around the calves with strips of cloth. Not just for warmth, but for swagger. And belts? Belts were a big deal. Sure, they held your pants up, but more importantly, they held your reputation in place. A finely crafted belt buckle could announce status more loudly than a war horn. Think of it as medieval bling. Cloaks were everywhere fastened with decorative brooches shaped like dragons, wolves, or runes. They weren't just functional, they were wearable myth, a visual flex for anyone within eyeshot. And Viking women? Absolutely not in shapeless sacks. They wore long linen or woolen underdresses, topped with shorter overdresses held in place by two iconic oval brooches at the shoulders. From these brooches hung strings of beads, charms, and sometimes even scissors or keys. These weren't just accessories, they were power symbols. You could learn who ran a household just by the jingle of her chest. And colour? Oh, they loved colour. Dyes were made from natural pigments, like yellow from birch leaves, red from madder roots, and blue from woad. These dyes weren't slapped on haphazardly. Viking clothing was layered in status, story, and self-expression. Every stitch said something. Even the thread was a flex. Yellow from birch leaves, red from madder root, blue from woad. Vikings didn't just wear nature, they dyed it. Rich, deep colours were status symbols, sure. But even the average Viking wasn't wandering around dressed like a wet potato sack. A single stripe of blue on a tunic or a red threaded trim at the cuff said, "I may not be wealthy, but my wife knows someone who sells decent dye." Footwear? Practical but still full of Viking personality. Most people wore simple leather shoes or boots, tied with toggles or laces. These weren't flashy unless you were rich, in which case your boots might have intricate stitching, silver rivets, or something dramatic carved into the heel just because you could. But Vikings didn't just wear their culture on their sleeves, they wore it on their heads. From braided locks to sculpted beards, Viking hair was more than hygiene. It was power, identity, sometimes flirting. Forget the wild, matted mop you've seen in gritty TV shows. Real Vikings groomed like it was a competitive sport. Hair was the face armor. And your beard? That was your signature. Beards came in all styles, forked, square cut, braided, or grown long enough to terrify enemies before you even picked up an axe. But just growing a beard wasn't enough. You had to sculpt it. Beard oil, probably made from animal fat and herbs, kept it shiny and soft. If your beard looked like a goat slept in it, No one was handing you mead at the feast. Women weren't left behind in the grooming game. Viking women took serious pride in their hair. Worn long, parted down the middle, usually braided or pinned into elaborate coils. For rituals or festivals, they decorated their hair with beads, colourful ribbons, and even bits of metal. These weren't just decorative. Hair could whisper. Married, wealthy. Don't mess with meal before you said a word. And let's talk braids. Vikings didn't just like braids, they celebrated them. Braids kept your hair tidy during farming, rowing, or mid-sprint, while chasing down a stolen goat. But they also looked fantastic. Many warriors wove leather cords or dyed threads into their braids, sometimes shaping them into runes or symbols of power. Imagine walking into battle with a beard shaped like a lightning bolt. That's intimidation meets performance art. Some Norsemen shaved the sides of their heads, leaving dramatic braided manes down the back. It may have started as a tribal identifier. It ended up as a fashion flexand, a convenient handle for bar fights. And they had the tools to keep those styles sharp. Hair care kits were standard: combs, razors, tweezers. Not hidden in some box either, these were hung proudly from belts or tucked into pouches. And yes, they even had mirrors. Tiny ones, made of polished metal. Because how else were you supposed to make sure your war braid didn't unravel mid-invasion? To a Viking, hair wasn't vanity. It was identity. It told your story before your voice did. Whether you were a shield maiden, a blacksmith, or a wandering bard, your hair was your personal saga. And it deserved maintenance. Now, if you're thinking Vikings were all about gritty practicality and nothing else, think again. These people loved their bling. Jewelry was everywhere, not just for sparkle, but for social structure, romance, wealth, and occasionally making other people jealous. A well-accessorized Viking wouldn't leave the house, or the raid, without at least a brooch, a ring, or something jangly that said, "I have a blacksmith cousin and I'm not afraid to flaunt it." Let's start with the classics. Brooches. Viking women wore them not just to hold their dresses in place, but to announce their presence. The famous oval, brooches typically worn at each shoulder, were often cast in bronze or silver and featured intricate designs, knotwork, animals, and even miniature mythological scenes. Between them, beaded strandsglass, amber, bone, metal charms like an ancient Norse resume. Here's my wealth. Here's my family status. Here's a bead from a festival I don't remember. Let's talk. For Viking men, the bling was all about arm rings and neck torques. Thick bands of twisted silver or bronze worn around biceps or throats. These weren't just accessories. These were currency, literally. A chieftain might give his warrior a silver arm ring as a reward for loyalty. If times got rough, the ring could be chopped into bits and weighed out like coin. Functional fashion at its finest. And rings? Everywhere. Fingers, toes, some inscribed with short runic blessings, or the Viking equivalent of "don't mess with me." Wedding rings were absolutely a thing, but forget dainty gold loops. These were sturdy, carved, meaningful. You didn't just say, "I do." You proved you could afford to. Sometimes a ring wasn't enough, so you'd gift a brooch, or a decorative pin shaped like a hammer, because nothing says eternal devotion like pointy jewelry. Which brings us to pendants, the final touch of Viking flair. The most popular? Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. Not just a religious icon. It was a charm, a protective amulet, and a bold fashion statement. These pendants were worn on cords of leather or woven fibre, sometimes carved from silver, sometimes bone or stone. Later, as Christianity made its way through Norse lands, crosses appeared too. But in true Viking fashion, many folks wore both, just in case. Insurance from all the gods. Vikings didn't see any problem mixing old beliefs with new ones. What if Thor's on a lunch break, they reasoned. Better keep Odin and Jesus happy. Because for the Vikings, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about style, strategy, and having backup gods in your accessories pouch. You think skincare was just for pampered queens or poets lounging under Persian moons? Think again. Vikings' yeas, those same thunderous sword-swinging legends of lore, surprisingly into their personal care routines. Hygiene didn't stop at a quick face splash from a river. These warriors had rituals, and they wore them with the same pride they did their scars. Let's talk about eyeliner. Because yes, that was a thing. Arabic chroniclers, like the traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, documented Viking men darkening their eyelids with a soot-like substance. Not just for flair though, it gave off strong, smouldering Sea King energy, but to reduce glare from snow and ocean sun. Imagine proto-sunglasses that made you look like a rock star ready for war. Practical? Absolutely. Fabulous? Even more so. The Vikings just said, why not both? No, they didn't have Viking Sephora tucked inside their long houses. But don't be fooled. Evidence shows they made time for skincare, fragrances, and herbal balms. Animal fat mixed with herbs created salves to protect against wind, heal sunburns, and soothe the aftermath of winter's bad attitude. Birch tar wasn't just for sealing ships, it doubled as an early bug repellent and impromptu skin treatment. It smelled like a bonfire's hangover, but it worked. And then there were the scents. If you thought Vikings walked around smelling like old meat and regret, you're in for a fragrant surprise. Herbs like thyme, mint, and sweet gale were crushed and stashed into garments, tucked into linen sachets, or swirled into bathwater. It wasn't perfume, but it was effective. You'd bathe, smell of pine and mint, and show up to battle like the forest itself was mad at you. Wealthier Norse folk even carried little scent pouches, basically the Viking version of a dryer sheet stuffed down your shirt. Women weren't just involved, they elevated the whole thing. Oils for hair and skin added shine, softness, and a whisper of wildflower scent. A radiant face wasn't about vanity, it was about status, discipline, and telling the world, I run this household and still manage to look incredible. Even their teeth were part of the look. Despite lacking modern dentistry, Viking skulls often show impressively clean teeth. Some even filed decorative grooves into their front teeth and might have filled them with pigment or resin. Was it tribal identification? Was it fashion? Was it the world's first tooth tattoo? Nobody knows. But it proves the point Vikings were not just warriors. They were style-forward, scent-conscious, eye-lining badasses with a grooming game stronger than half of modern influencers. And no, Viking kids didn't run around looking like they fell out of a hay cart, unless they wanted a face full of freezing fjord water and a disappointed sigh from mom. Cleanliness wasn't a grown-up luxury. It was a family standard. Kids were expected to look presentable, part pride, part practicality. Tunics for boys, long dresses for girls, often layered with cloaks or aprons. Materials, wool and linen were staples. Soft leather showed up in footwear in colder regions, because even toddlers needed grip when sprinting after runaway goats or during spontaneous village-wide sheep chases. And those weren't just scraps of hide tied to little feet. Viking children wore actual, functional shoes stitched, toggled, and made to last longer than a spring storm. Because if you're going to grow into a raider, you'd better learn to walk like one. The colour game was strong too. Even young Vikings wore dyed fabrics if their family could afford it. Rich yellows, ocean blues, blood red saul naturally sourced and proudly displayed. Special events called for embroidery and flair. If your kid was being introduced at a thing, think ancient Norse PTA meetings meets epic story hour, they wouldn't be showing up in rags. They'd be braided, belted, and brushed within an inch of their wild little lives. Hair, managed, adorned. Girls often wore tiny braids with beadwork or charms. Boys might get shortcuts or the early training styles of their fathers like Warrior Fade, Beginner Edition. And just like their parents, kids bathed. Skipping bath day? Not an option. Unless you wanted to be that child at the feast, the one nobody wanted near the mead. Even grooming tools became heirlooms. A small carved bone comb given from father to son wasn't just practical. It said, someday you'll grow a beard. Keep it neat, or grandma will. From the youngest age, Viking children were raised to embody their culture's expectations. Honor, dignity, and an appropriate appreciation for braided hair. Because even at 6, you were already part of the saga. And the saga doesn't wait for messy hair and dirty fingernails. Of course, maintaining this clean and shiny reputation was easy when you had a bathhouse and a quiet stream. But what about when you were 100 miles from home, sleeping on a damp longship, eating fermented fish, and ducking the occasional arrow? You packed your grooming kit, obviously. Viking warriors took their hygiene on the road, or more accurately, on the fjord. Travelling warriors didn't leave their vanity at home. They rolled up to raids looking fierce and smelling faintly of pine and moss. Small grooming kitscombs, tweezers, ear spoons, razors were kept in pouches or hung from belts right alongside the weapons. One side, axe. Other side, hair comb, balance. Bathing was harder on the road, but not impossible. Rainwater barrels, streams, or quick dips in cold rivers kept the worst of the grime off. And even at sea, if you had a spare moment and no one was screaming, you might pull out a little metal mirror and check if your war braid had come undone. Priorities. Because at the end of the day, the Viking code wasn't just fight, feast, and shout at storms. It was fight fiercely, look good doing it, and smell decent enough that the ravens didn't follow you around assuming you were already dead. Follow or subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the truth behind these Viking myths, and stick around, because next time we're diving even deeper into the surprising sophistication of the Norse world, from rituals and beliefs to how they buried their dead. Spoiler, there may be fire. This saga's just getting warmed up. Let me ask you something. What kind of warrior walks into a raid with a razor in one hand and a comb in the other? If you said, a Viking, congratulations, you've been paying attention. Because while most people still imagine these warriors as mud-splattered madmen swinging axes and sneezing lice, the truth is far more interesting. Vikings weren't just brutal, they were beautifully brutal. You see, long before hair salons and premium beard oils, Viking warriors were packing grooming kits. Real, functional, no-nonsense sets of tools tucked into leather pouches, hanging right next to their axes, tweezers, razors, combs, and yes, even tiny spoons to clean their ears. Why? Because what's the point of conquering a village if you show up looking like you lost a fight with a swamp? This wasn't vanity. It was necessity, part of the warrior's identity. A matted, grimy beard could snag in your helmet strap. Loose hair in your eyes could cost you your head in a sword fight. And lice? Lice didn't care if you were a chieftain or a foot soldier. They were the true enemy of the scalp. So they shaved, trimmed, and plucked like their lives depended on it. Because sometimes they did. Their razors were sharp, no frills toolsome, even curved, just right to hug the jawline. A Viking didn't need a foggy mirror. A still stream was enough. All it took was a steady hand, and the will to not flinch while staring into your own face beside a river. And it wasn't just their beards that got the attention. Vikings travelled with sewing needles and waxed thread. If their tunic tore, they stitched. If their cloak frayed, they reinforced it. One warrior might behead an enemy in the morning and repair a shoulder seam by nightfall. Imagine your battle-hardened uncle fixing a button while humming a war chant that was the vibe. Why? Because sloppy clothing could kill. A torn hem snagged during a charge. A loose boot slowed your retreat. Wet wool clung like cold death. So they patched, they dried, they folded. Vikings were warriors, but they were also surprisingly good at laundry. And when it came to finding water, they planned ahead. Raiding parties camped near springs or rivers, not just to drink but to wash. Sure, the water was cold. Sure, it wasn't exactly spa day. But even a quick rinse beat carrying last week's sweat into battle. When possible, they'd even heat water in iron pots to create improvised baths in the wild. It wasn't luxurious, but compared to the rest of medieval Europe, it was borderline elegant. They bathed, they cleaned, and yes, they presented. Viking sagas often describe heroes combing their hair and washing their hands before entering battle or a feast. That wasn't just poetic license, that was real. Because whether you were about to slit throats or sip mead, you did it looking your best. Personal hygiene was part of personal honor. A wild man with clean fingernails? That was a Viking flex. And if you still picture Vikings as rabid swamp dwellers, swinging axes with fleas in their beards, let me offer a reality check. That image dirt-caked, snarling, bug-ridden was built by their enemies. And let's be honest, if someone torched your monastery, stole your gold, and looked fresh doing it, you'd trash-talk them in the history books too. In fact, many of the sources that paint Vikings as filthy come from envious Christian monks. These were men who often saw bathing as suspicious, sinful even. Vikings, on the other hand, treated it like a religion. Cleanliness was next to godliness, especially if your god was Odin and your comb doubled as a weapon. Monks hated it. They wrote, with a mixture of disgust and defeat, about how Viking men changed their shirts regularly, took baths, combed their hair, and worst of all, women liked them for it. One monk even complained that local women were falling for Norsemen simply because they bathed every Saturday and had tidy hair. Translation? These guys are too clean, too charming, and it's ruining our game. Vikings didn't just raid, they seduced, with soap. And even in popular shows today, the image of the gritty, muddy, axe-drenched Norseman persists. Sure, some shows get closer to the truth, but they still overdo the dirt. Because in real life, if a Viking walked into a feast looking like he'd been dragged behind a horse, he wouldn't be feared. He'd be judged. Reputation mattered. Appearance was everything. A warrior's strength wasn't just in the blade he carried, but how well he carried himself. A woman's dress, her hair, the way she presented her household all reflected honor and pride. The Vikings understood something many cultures forgot. Chaos on the battlefield did not excuse chaos on your face. Even in death, the grooming continued. Combs, razors, and hygiene tools have been found in Viking graves, nestled beside swords and shields. They believed you needed to look your best in the afterlife too. You weren't going to show up in Valhalla looking like a mess. Not with Thor watching. And while most of Europe was still debating whether water was a demon's trick, the Norse had already packed a bath, a beard comb, and maybe a change of socks. So the next time someone tells you Vikings were filthy, unkempt savages, tell them this: no one brings a grooming kit to war unless they mean business. Follow or subscribe to the channel for more myth-busting stories, forgotten facts, and wild slices of history that prove truth is always stranger and more stylish than fiction. We've only scratched the surface of what made the Viking world tick. And next up, you won't believe what the women of Sparta were doing while the rest of ancient Greece was locking their wives indoors. What happens when the fiercest women in the ancient world weren't cloaked in silence or shadow but wrapped in authority, wit, and muscle? You step into Sparta and find out. Unlike their hidden Athenian sisters, Spartan women weren't confined to weaving in the corners of quiet homes. They walked boldly through public spaces. They spoke, and when they did, people listened. These women were sharp, both in mind and tongue. They could read. They could write. And more importantly, they could sting with a sentence. Spartan mothers became legends with one-liners. One woman, handing her son his shield before battle, didn't whisper a prayer or shed a tear. She simply said, "Come back with iter on it." That wasn't poetic. That was protocol. But power in Sparta didn't stop at quips and courage. Spartan women were also landowners, real estate moguls in bronze. In a society dominated by warriors constantly off dying for glory, women kept the economy from collapsing. Some estimates say Spartan women controlled up to 1/3 of all land in the region. When the men marched off to war, they didn't leave behind fragile widows. They left bosses in sandals. These weren't women who begged to be heard. They were women people turned to. They managed estates, negotiated dowries, challenged decisions, and weren't afraid to call out a bad one, especially if it involved their sons. You didn't marry a Spartan woman to complete your household. You married her because she was the backbone of it. And love? Oh, Spartan romance wasn't all moonlit dances and coy glances. It started with strategy and a hint of theatrical kidnapping. Yes, getting married in Sparta involved a ritual abduction. The groom didn't just say, "I do." He staged a nighttime raid. The bride didn't throw a bouquet, was symbolically stolen. But don't get confused, this wasn't some barbaric free-for-all. It was ritual. A performance agreed upon by both families, often with political alliances in mind. Once the marriage was arranged, the groom and his friends would stealthily kidnap the bride from her home and whisk her away to a secret location. And what happened next? Well, things got even stranger. In that private space, an older woman would shave the bride's head, dress her in a man's cloak and sandals, and lay her down on a straw bed. Why the makeover? Scholars are still debating. Some believe it symbolized a transformation from girl to woman. Others say it reflected Sparta's obsession with strength. Masculine traits were idealized, even in brides. Whatever the reason, the bride became something in between, stripped of softness, ready for a hard world. Then came the secret meetings. The groom didn't move in. Instead, for weeks or even months, he'd sneak out of his military barracks at night to visit his new wife, whispering romance and duty by candlelight, before vanishing before dawn. These were marriages of stealth, of routine rendezvous, and quiet commitment. They were warriors by day, lovers by night, until the state finally allowed them to live together. And that wouldn't happen until the husband turned 30. That's right. In Sparta, your wedding didn't come with a house and garden. It came with a separate living arrangement and years of curfew. From age 7, Spartan boys were sucked into the agogia, brutal training system that turned soft children into steel-spined warriors. Even after graduating, they were still bound to their military units. The only home they had was the barracks, where duty to the state outweighed any domestic desire. So even after the ritual, even after the hushed nights, you didn't go home. You went back to your bunk. You spent years meeting your wife in secret, because discipline came first, and intimacy second. It wasn't about depriving men of love, it was about keeping warriors sharp. Sparta didn't want soft husbands. It wanted hardened heroes. And yet, this didn't lead to lonely, powerless wives. On the contrary, the women ran the show. With husbands off drilling and dying, wives inherited the day-to-day world. They managed property, oversaw slaves, conducted trade, and raised the next generation of warriors. Some women grew wealthy and influential, respected, not just in their homes, but in the community at large. In Athens, women were hidden. In Sparta, they were heard. And when it came to children, romance had little to do with it. Producing strong offspring wasn't personal, it was patriotic. If a man was too weak to father future soldiers, the state could approve someone stronger to step in. That's right, Sparta practiced state-sanctioned substitution. The goal wasn't love, it was legacy. Motherhood in Sparta wasn't sentimental, it was sacred duty. Every child born was a potential soldier or mother of soldiers. And that responsibility lay squarely on the women. They weren't just bearers of life, they were the moulders of Sparta's future. So what do you call a society where women were educated, wealthy, independent, and dangerous with words? You call it radical, you call it Sparta. And if you're enjoying this journey into the fiercest corners of ancient history, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the channel, because there's more where this came from, more forgotten truths, more spine-tingling facts, and more history that hits different. What if I told you that, in one corner of the ancient world, motherhood wasn't just sacred, it was state-sanctioned warfare? That giving birth wasn't a private affair of tenderness, but a patriotic act, loaded with expectation and duty? Welcome to Sparta, where a woman's womb was her country's most strategic weapon. Spartan women weren't praised for embroidery or docile grace. They weren't quietly admired for soft words or delicate steps. No, what they were celebrated for was this: raising sons so strong they could stand shoulder to shoulder with death and not flinch. In Sparta, childbirth wasn't just a biological role, it was a battlefield. And every child born wasn't just someone's baby, they were a future blade in Sparta's arsenal. From their earliest years, girls were groomed for this role with intensity. Not only were they trained in the household skills that sustained a family, they also ran, wrestled, hurled discuses, and built their muscles. It wasn't sport for fun. It was preparation for building bodies capable of bearing warriors. The Spartan belief was crystal clear: weak mothers make weak soldiers. And Sparta didn't have space for either. When a Spartan woman gave birth, there was no gentle cooing from the elders. The state had protocols. The newborn was inspected closely. If the child appeared fragile, sickly, or malformed in any way, they weren't welcomed. They were left on the cold slope of Mount Taygetus, exposed to the elements. Harsh? Absolutely. But to Spartans, it wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Survival was the only currency, and weakness was too expensive to carry. But when a woman brought forth a strong son, her standing rose. In a society without elected queens, Spartan mothers became sacred symbols. Their pride wasn't worn with jewels or painted lips, it echoed in public honor. A mother who had lost not one, but multiple sons in battle could be celebrated. revered like a living monument to Spartan ideals. They weren't pitied, they were saluted. These women didn't just raise warriors, they molded them. Before boys were handed over to the brutal state-run Agoge at age 7, it was their mothers who taught them the foundation of Spartan strength, discipline, pride, silence in suffering, and defiance in fear. The first whisper of courage didn't come from a commander. It came from a mother. And daughters? They were shaped too. Shaped into the next generation of fierce Spartan women, brilliant, fearless, and unashamed to raise their voice in a council full of men. The girls stayed with their mothers, learned the history of their people, the responsibility of the household, and most importantly, how to command presence. Family lineage wasn't just ancestry, it was ammunition. Spartan noblewomen often came from elite warrior families, and those bloodlines carried weight. Marriages were strategic, yes, but the status of the mother shaped the prestige of the household. It wasn't just about who your father was, it was who raised you that defined your legacy. And here's the truth no one tells you. While the rest of the ancient world wrapped their women in ownership and silence, Spartan women held the keys to real powerland, massive amounts of it. By some estimates, they controlled nearly a third of all property in Sparta. Not metaphorically, literally. These women didn't just inherit wealth, they managed it, multiplied it, and made it work. While men trained for war or died in it, women stepped into the economic vacuum and never let go. This wasn't a loophole, it was a system that worked, and one that terrified outsiders. Spartan law allowed women to inherit from both fathers and husbands. With so many men dying young, widows were not rare and many were wealthy. But more than wealth, they had authority. These women ran estates, oversaw helot labourers, managed agricultural production, and brokered deals. Picture them not in flowing gowns, but in working tunics with rolled sleeves, counting grain, directing servants, signing contracts, running Sparta while the warriors were away. Even the most powerful men outside Sparta hated this idea. Aristotle, the great philosopher, spat ink in frustration. He blamed the unruly Spartan women for the decline of Sparta's dominance. Why? Because they had too much freedom, too much voice, too much influence. Translation: he was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of women having more control than the average Athenian man. But in Sparta, it made perfect sense. The men were soldiers. They weren't home long enough to be landlords. Someone had to keep the world spinning. So the women did. Not because it was progressive, but because it was practical. But the outcome? Revolutionary. Women who were educated, authoritative, and economically independent. Women who didn't just support warriors, they funded them. Now, you might assume that all this discipline and power meant the women abandoned femininity or beauty. Quite the opposite. Spartan women were strong and stunning. And unlike their Athenian cousins who remained veiled and hidden, Spartan women walked tall through the agora, unashamed of their sun-touched skin, their muscle tone, or their sharp words. They didn't whisper, they debated, they didn't flutter behind fans. They faced men and matched them word for word, step for step. Beauty in Sparta wasn't fragility, it was health, it was strength, it was confidence that radiated. Pale, pampered faces were frowned upon. A tan wasn't lowly, it was vitality. And whether at home or in public, Spartan women knew how to command attention. Their clothing wasn't purely decorative either. It was functional and freeing, tailored for movement rather than modesty. Their appearance mirrored their values. No fluff, no fear, all fire. And here's something even more compelling. The Spartan state encouraged it. It wanted women who stood strong, who trained hard, who bore fierce sons and led fierce lives. It was a system built not on suppressing women, but on sharpening them. So the next time someone pictures the ancient world as a man's stage, remind them of Sparta, where women weren't shadows behind warriors, they were the storm beside them. And if this reshaped your view of what women could do in ancient history, imagine what's coming next. Hit that follow or subscribe button now, because this story, it's just heating up. What if I told you the fiercest, most powerful women in the ancient world didn't rule from thrones? They ran barefoot under the sun, muscles flexing, voices loud, while the rest of Greece stared in scandalized silence. These weren't veiled aristocrats hiding behind lace fans. These were Spartan women, bold, built, and absolutely unbothered by anyone's opinion but their own. In Sparta, a woman's beauty wasn't measured by how delicate her features were or how pale her skin looked beneath layers of silk. Beauty was function. Muscles meant freedom. Tanned skin meant strength. Spartan women trained outdoors, moved with confidence, and radiated health like a living statue carved by discipline. They didn't need frills to be noticed. They owned the room just by walking into it. Their clothing told the story, while Athenian women were practically swaddled in folds of fabric designed to hide and restrict. Spartan women wore the peplum simple, breathable, sometimes slit at the sides for easy movement. To the rest of Greece, it looked outrageous. To Spartans, it was just smart. Practicality over modesty, function over fuss. After all, how can you throw a discus or wrestle in 10 layers of linen? Hair was worn long and loose, not to tempt, but to symbolize adulthood and liberty. There's no evidence Spartan women fussed with makeup or elaborate cosmetics. They weren't powdering their noses for male approval. Their glow came from sweat, sun, and sheer self-respect. Their confidence wasn't painted on, it was earned through sweat and effort. Cleanliness mattered, fitness mattered, confidence mattered. Vanity? Not so much. You wouldn't find them tucked quietly in back rooms either. Spartan women showed up, loudly. They danced in public festivals. They sang in choruses. They participated in religious rituals and even athletic competitions of their own. They weren't spectators in society, they were stars in the arena of public life. Contrast this with Athens, where a woman's dignity was measured by how little she was seen or heard. In Sparta, being heard was the point. Their reputation began with their voice. And boy, did they use it. Foreign observers, especially men, were rattled. What others saw as shamelessness, Sparta saw as pride. What outsiders interpreted as wild behavior, the Spartans viewed as virtue. They didn't wear gold crowns or jeweled bracelets to show their worth. Their true power came through words, and those words could cut deeper than any spear. You want to see ancient gender roles turned completely upside down? Just listen to how Spartan women spoke. These weren't shy, giggling maidens hiding behind fathers and husbands. These were women who made grown men feel like children with a single sentence. They were educated, sharp-witted, and trained in the power of speech. Not only could they read and write, but they also memorized poetry, mastered music, and most impressively learned to debate like philosophers with a blade. In most of ancient Greece, a woman's silence was her virtue. In Sparta, silence was suspicious. When Spartan women spoke, the world listened. Historical records are full of jaw-dropping quotes from these iron-tongued mothers. One mother, upon hearing that her son died in battle, didn't weep. She simply said, "I bore him for that very purpose." Another, upon learning her son had fled the battlefield, responded with chilling clarity, "Why do you still live?" These weren't cruel responses, they were cultural truths. Spartan values placed state above self, and Spartan women upheld that truth like it was law. They didn't just direct this fire at their children. Spartan wives publicly mocked cowardice in men, especially their own husbands. A man could win battles and still come home to be put in his place if he didn't hold up his honor. It wasn't disrespect. It was standard. In Sparta, a weak man embarrassed his entire household and his wife, had every right to call him out for it. But let's make one thing clear. These women weren't heartless statues in tunics. They loved, they grieved. But their emotion was wrapped in layers of discipline. Losing a son was tragic, but if he died with honor, it was also triumphant. Spartan women carried grief like a badge, not to show off pain, but to show the price of pride. And yes, the world outside Sparta hated this. Greek writers couldn't stop commenting on how unladylike the Spartan women were. Their bold speech, their public visibility, their refusal to act fragilite, didn't sit right with the delicate male egos of the time. But Sparta didn't care. It wasn't in the business of winning beauty pageants. It was in the business of surviving and thriving. In a world where women were told to be soft, Spartan women were unyielding. They were mentors, disciplinarians, political influencers, and if needed, public firebrands. Their weapons weren't always iron-tipped. Sometimes they were words so sharp that even kings blushed. And when it came to relationships? Oh, Sparta threw out the rulebook there too. While most of ancient Greece upheld strict sexual fidelity for women, at least Sparta played by a different set of rules. Here, marriage wasn't about romance or religious ideals. It was biology. Reproduction was a civic responsibility. The state needed soldiers, and if that meant bending the rules of monogamy for the greater good, so be it. If a Spartan man was too old, too weak, or too often away at war, it wasn't shocking for another, stronger man to be invited to father children with his wife, not behind closed doors, not in secret shame, but as a state-sanctioned solution. Because what mattered wasn't ego, it was survival. It sounds shocking today, but to the Spartans, it was just logic. Love and fidelity were luxuries. Strength and legacy were necessities. The society wasn't designed around personal satisfaction. It was built for collective endurance. And Spartan women weren't property. They had a say. They knew their worth and had the agency to make or refuse such arrangements. So imagine a culture where women walked freely, owned property, debated in public, dominated domestic life, managed estates, raised warriors, and also had the power to decide who fathered their children. That was Sparta. And if that flips your understanding of the ancient world upside down, good, because this wasn't mythology, this was real history. These women didn't just raise soldiers. They shaped one of the most feared, respected, and unique civilizations the world has ever known. Spartan women were bold, brilliant, and utterly unforgettable. And if you're loving these forgotten truths, there's more coming, so don't forget to follow or subscribe the channel. You've only scratched the surface. What if the government cared more about your abs than your tax bracket? What if making babies was a military strategy, not a private matter? In ancient Sparta, reproduction wasn't left to love, luck, or wine-fueled weddings. No, it was state-sanctioned business. And if that meant bending the rules of marriage, then so be it. A Spartan woman could be temporarily paired, yes, even while married with another man, not for love or scandal, but purely to ensure strong offspring. The goal wasn't romance, it was genetic excellence. Statecraft disguised as seduction. There are accounts, some whispered, some blunt-off older husbands encouraging their younger, brawnier peers to father children with their wives, not in secret shame, but sometimes with full permission, as if passing on the torch of muscle and valor. And here's the twist. It wasn't always arranged by men. If a woman admired a powerful, respected Spartan and wanted his children, she could seek his seed with her husband's blessing. No side eyes, no guilt, just civic cooperation for the greater good. This wasn't polyamory. It wasn't indulgent or liberal. It was national duty, raw and cold. Love was optional. Strength was not. The Spartans didn't measure family trees. They measured bone density and loyalty. And babies born from these arrangements? Fully legitimate as long as both parents were full Spartan citizens. No need for whispered lineage or secret bloodlines. If the child could one day hold a shield and wield a spear, that was enough. But let's not pretend everyone enjoyed this freedom. These breeding arrangements were the privilege of Spartiates, the elite class. The helots and lower-class folk weren't writing the rules. They were laboring under them. In Sparta, not all bodies were created equal, and only the best bodies were trusted to produce the next generation of warriors. Yet, in that narrow space of privilege, Spartan women wielded a radical kind of sexual autonomy. While Athenian women were locked away to preserve their purity, Spartan women were trusted to make calculated choices. In Athens, women's fidelity was chained to reputation. In Sparta, it was chained to survival. And make no mistake, every child born wasn't just a bundle of joy. It was a calculated investment in Sparta's future. A potential hoplite, a future mother of warriors, a name on a rostra, a life sacrificed to keep the phalanx strong. Even after Sparta fell, the legend of these women refused to die. They weren't remembered as gentle wives or doting mothers. They were remembered as commanders of life, fierce and unapologetically pragmatic. Outsiders painted them as strange curiosities or cautionary tales. But that wasn't the whole truth. These women were something rarer, autonomous, respected, and indispensable. In their own time, they were walking contradictions. Landowners in a patriarchal society, public speakers in a world that silenced women. They were admired for muscle, not modesty. Their beauty wasn't soft, it was sharpened by discipline and defiance. And no, they didn't wait around for instruction. They gave the instructions. They managed estates, raised warriors, delivered biting political insights in public. They even influenced reproduction at the state level. In the most male-dominated, militarized society of the ancient world, they carved out power not through protest, but by mastering the very rules meant to restrict them. It wasn't feminism as we know it. These women weren't activists, they were realists. Their freedoms were granted by necessity, forged in fire by a society that needed them strong. And within that structure, they thrived without shame, without apology. And that's why their legend still echoes not in romantic epics, but in the raw steel of memory. Philosophers like Aristotle scorned them. Roman historians obsessed over them. Modern scholars still wrestle with how they fit in a world built for men. But that's the thing they didn't fit. They redefined the mold. Spartan women weren't background characters. They were the architecture of the city's power. The quiet storm behind every warrior, the financier behind every campaign, the strategist behind every soldier who dared die in battle. Their names may not be etched in stone like kings, but they were the ones who made Sparta function. They weren't soft hands handing off laundry. They were calloused commanders of land and legacy. And while the rest of the world denied women even basic rights, Sparta gave them control over property, reproduction, and even public image. That scared people. It still does. Because these women didn't just navigate a male world, they excelled in it. And when it came to death? The Spartans had opinions on that too. Harsh ones. In Athens, funerals were long, emotional affairs. Grief was theatrical. In Egypt, burials were lavish, ornate, packed with offerings. But in Sparta, death was stripped down to its core. A test, a measurement of whether you had served your city. If you passed, great. If not, no parade, no inscription, no drama. Most Spartans were buried in silence, without even a name on their grave. Not because they were forgotten, but because being remembered was a privilege. Only two types of people got their names carved in stone. Men who died bravely in battle and women who died during childbirth. That's it. Everyone else faded anonymously into the soil. To us, that might sound cruel. But to the Spartans, it was perfectly logical. If you hadn't made your death meaningful to the state, what was the point in making your name permanent? And yet, that anonymity was its own kind of glory. You didn't live to be remembered. You lived to contribute. And if you were remembered, you had earned it with blood or breath. So next time you picture ancient women in flowing robes, whispering behind silk curtains, think again. The Spartan woman walked in daylight, called out cowards, signed land deals, chose who fathered her children, and if necessary, died without ceremony. And still, her memory hits like the clang of steel. If that blew your assumptions wide open, there's more where that came from. Follow or subscribe the channel. We're not done rewriting history just yet. What if dying quietly in your bed made you a disgrace? What if slipping in the bath was shameful, but bleeding out on the battlefield earned you immortality? In ancient Sparta, death wasn't a tragedy. It was a test stand you passed only if you gave your life to the state. A life well lived meant nothing if it didn't end the right way. For Spartan men, that meant dying in the most brutal, most public, most valorous fashion possible. In the clash of war, shield in hand, refusing to back down. To perish from old age or illness was unimpressive. A man who collapsed with a fever? Forgettable. But a man who stood his ground and died holding the line? He became legend. Spartans didn't romanticize death. They weaponized it. The battlefield was not just a place to fight, it was a stage to prove your worth to your ancestors, your city, and your very identity. No return ticket. No sobbing farewells. Just one question. Did you die well? And for women, the battlefield was different but no less sacred. Their trial was the birthing bed. A woman who died giving birth was honored equally because in Sparta's eyes, She had fulfilled her highest civic duty, bringing forth the next generation of warriors. That was her war. That was her sacrifice. And for that, she too earned the rarest of honors, a grave marked with her name. Everyone else? The craftsmen, the elderly, the merchants who died peacefully after long, decent lives, they were buried quietly, their names unwritten, appreciated perhaps, but not glorified. Sparta didn't reward longevity, it worshipped sacrifice. Mourning? Limited. A few days. Loud weeping or theatrical grief. Heavily discouraged. Spartans weren't taught to cry. They were taught to honor the fallen by living up to their example, not wallowing in loss. When someone died, one question rang louder than all others. What did their death contribute? Did they protect the state? Did they suffer for Sparta's future? If yes, they were remembered. If not, they faded into silence. From the moment a boy entered the agoge at age 7, he was groomed for one outcome-y death worth writing down. That death couldn't be in a barn accident or from the flu. It had to be in formation, blade drawn, refusing retreat. To fall on the battlefield was the apex of a Spartan's existence. Everything before it was preparation. Even the gear told this story. The Spartan shield wasn't just defense. It was a symbol of community. Drop your sword. Maybe you live to fight again. Drop your shield, and you've betrayed your brothers in the phalanx. One soldier's shield protected the man beside him. It was never just about you. It was about all of you. That's why mothers didn't whisper soft goodbyes. They sent sons off with brutal clarity. Come back with your shield, or on it. Translation? Win or die trying. Cowards came back empty-handed. Heroes didn't come back at all. And if you did die right, you were remembered forever. A name chiseled into stone. Public honor. Songs sung. Stories told. Your family basked in the reflected glow of your courage. They didn't wear black. They walked tall. Because you had lived and died as Sparta demanded. But even then, no ornate sculptures, no elaborate funerals, a modest stone, a simple symbol. Your deeds, not your tomb, made you eternal. The Spartans believed that the more beautiful the death, the less it needed decoration. Your memory was the monument. And Sparta applied the same logic to its women. Their battle was childbirth, their glory, survivaler, noble death in the act of creating life. If a woman died in labor, she didn't vanish into history like so many others in the ancient world. Her name was carved, her sacrifice respected. Why? Because she gave everything for the future of Sparta. She didn't do it for applause. She did it because it was expected. She knew the stakes. Every baby born was a potential shield bearer. Every successful birth was a strategic victory. Her death wasn't mourned with wails and flowers. It was recognized with something far rarer: respect. In a society where even men weren't guaranteed remembrance, a woman who died in childbirth was granted immortality in stone. And that stone meant everything. Not vanity, not status. It was a mark of ultimate contribution. Because in Sparta, honor didn't come from how long you lived, it came from how well you died. And let's be honest, this wasn't about kindness or compassion. It was about order, control, and national efficiency. Emotions were kept tight. Grief had no room to grow wild. The dead didn't need indulgence. They needed to inspire. They needed to remind the living that their final test was always waiting. And even myth didn't escape this thinking. Leonidas and his 300 at Thermopylae. They weren't celebrated because they won. They didn't. They were enshrined because they stood and fell when others ran. They died right. They died well. And to Sparta, that was enough. Other cities wrote poems about their dead. Sparta wrote names and silence. A grave, a shield, a legacy. Even in death, the Spartan woman remained central. Not because she fought with a sword, but because she created the ones who did. Her pain was not private, it was patriotic. She didn't beg for recognition. She earned it. There was no parade, no hymns. Just her name, carved quietly into stone. And in that quiet, Sparta spoke volumes. So next time you picture the ancient world honoring kings and priests, Think of her, the woman who gave her life in birth, remembered not with tears, but with stone. She didn't need to be seen. She needed to be known. Because in Sparta, that was the highest kind of fame. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of mind we want here. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's keep uncovering the side of history that textbooks forgot. Imagine a society where a woman's death in childbirth was treated like a soldier's death in battle, not with pity, but with pride. Where her name wasn't just remembered, but etched in stone as a mark of heroic sacrifice. In Sparta, the final act of giving life was recognized as dying in service to the state. Spartan girls didn't grow up pampered or passive. From childhood, they were trained to be strong, resilient, and disciplined. Not just to survive, but to prepare their bodies for war in a different form, motherhood. This wasn't vanity. It was national strategy. Strong women produced strong sons, and strong sons were Sparta's lifeblood. This cold arithmetic governed every aspect of life. A woman's worth wasn't tied to how delicate she looked or how obedient she acted. This wasn't Athens or Corinth, where beauty and silence defined womanhood. In Sparta, her value was bound to her legacy, children she bore, the property she managed, and in rare, sacred instances, the life she gave to ensure Sparta's future. The idea of childbirth as a form of battlefield heroism may feel jarring today, but to Spartans, it made perfect sense. The agony, the blood, the risk it mirrored the very trials faced by warriors in armor. And that's why when a Spartan woman died during labor, she wasn't quietly buried and forgotten. Her death was revered, her name recorded for eternity, a solemn mark of respect for a life given in the service of the state. Outsiders couldn't understand this. To many Greeks, Spartan women seemed wild, masculine, unseemly in their boldness. But they missed the point. Inside Sparta, these women were the foundation. Steel wrapped in flesh, pillars of quiet courage, and when the time came, martyrs with unmatched resolve. Funerals in Sparta didn't indulge grief. Unlike Athens, where death was draped in wailing voices, torn garments, and theatrical mourning, Sparta stripped the process down to its essence. No professional mourners, no public drama. Death was met with silence and discipline, not spectacle. You could grieve, but only for a moment. Mourning was regulated by law. It wasn't forbidden, but it was restrained. Spartan restraint didn't die when the heart stopped beating. It followed the body into the earth. Burials happened fast, typically within a day. There were no long wakes, no candle-lit vigils, no elaborate displays. Grieving was done quickly, quietly, and mostly in private. If someone wept too loudly or threw themselves over the casket, they weren't seen as more loving. They were seen as undisciplined. Because in Sparta, you didn't prove your love by falling apart. You proved it by standing tall, even in heartbreak. If the deceased was a man, he might be wrapped in a cloak and carried by his brothers, in arms laid on the one thing he was never supposed to drop, his shield. If it was a woman, her burial was simpler still. No gold, no jewels, just cloth and reverence. Wealth meant nothing in death. The grandeur of your tomb didn't matter. What mattered was the life you lived and the reason you died. Most Spartans were buried outside the city, in quiet graveyards that whispered their stories only to those who looked closely. And unless you died in battle or childbirth, your grave was unmarked, no inscription, no tribute, just earth and silence. But if you had earned that final recognition, your name was etched in stone. No poems, no statues, just a name maybe, a symbol. And that, to Sparta, was everything. You had passed the ultimate test. You had done your part. Even the number of funeral attendees was capped by law. Who could wear black? Who could shave their heads? How long mourning lasted it was all carefully outlined. Because grief, like everything in Sparta, had to serve a higher purpose. The city must go on. Cremation? Rare. Bodies were returned to the earth directly, simple, fast, and without ritualized drama. No grand mausoleums, no towering monuments. Not because they lacked respect, but because they believed the soul's glory lived in memory, not marble. Children were raised in this mindset. If your father died in war, you didn't fall to your knees in anguish. You stood straighter. If your mother perished giving life, you didn't sob in the streets. You carried her legacy, and you did it without complaint. In Sparta, a funeral wasn't the end of a life. It was the start of a story, a legacy, that others were expected to uphold with equal discipline and courage. And that legacy came down to two sacred symbols, the shield and the shroud. The shield, flat, broad, unyielding, wasn't just a weapon. It was the soul of the phalanx, the key to Spartan formation and survival. You could drop your spear, you could lose your helmet, but never your shield, because that shield didn't just protect you, it protected the warrior to your left. It symbolized unity, loyalty, and readiness to die for each other. So when a Spartan fell in combat, he was brought back on his shield not as a ritual, but as a statement. This man stood his ground. This man didn't run. And now, in death, he lay on the very thing he once used to shield his brothers. It was the ultimate testimony. He died with honor, and for women the symbol was different, but no less powerful. The burial shroud was not born of combat. It came from the home from the hearth. And often, the woman was wrapped in a cloth she had woven herself. A personal final layer, not flashy, not adorned, but hers. Where the shield declared a warrior's courage, the shroud whispered of a woman's quiet strength, her domestic battlefield, and the pain she endured to give the state another life. No choir sang, no dirge was composed. But in these two objects, the shield and the shroud, Sparta wrote its final words. And they said this: "You gave everything. That is enough." If you're drawn to stories like this, unseen courage, untold power, and the raw truth behind history's most misunderstood civilizations, follow or subscribe the channel. There's much more where this came from. Imagine a place where the ultimate tribute to a woman wasn't flowers or hymnsit, was a plain cloth she spun with her own hands, wrapped around her lifeless body. No gold, no perfumes, no marble tombs. Just that one piece of fabric, sacred in its simplicity, whispering to the world that she had fulfilled her duty to Sparta and paid for it in full. That was the price, and that was enough. In this city where sentiment bowed before discipline, even death was stripped down to function. The shrouds that wrapped Spartan women weren't decorative, weren't soaked in perfume or adorned with trinkets. They were woven with purpose, threads pulled and twisted by the very hands they would eventually embrace in death. These weren't burial garments, they were final testaments. No precious stones, no carved angels watching over graves, just these simple cloths and the unshakable silence that followed. And for the warriors, it was no different. The shield carried into battle was also the bed on which their bodies would be brought home scratched, bloodied, but still bearing the weight of honor. One object, forged for war, now quietly declaring that its owner never fled. The other, spun from wool and wear, saying her body gave life to the state. These weren't tokens of loss. They were certificates of completion. There were no flowery speeches, no long ceremonies, no towering monuments shouting about who lay beneath. A man brought back on his shield, a woman wrapped in the cloth she crafted. That was it. And in Sparta, that was everything. Elsewhere in the Greek world, grief thundered. Women wailed, tore their clothes, scattered ashes with trembling hands. But Sparta? Sparta whispered, and sometimes it didn't speak at all. Mourning wasn't measured by noise, it was measured by control. In this place where every day was a test of endurance, death wasn't an exception, it was just the final exam. And public grief? That was seen not as a tribute, but as a distraction. Pain, yes, but private. Mourning, yes, but measured. Emotion didn't lead, discipline did. You didn't collapse in the street because your father died in battle. You stood taller. You didn't sob in front of the fire because your mother died giving birth. You carried her name like a torch. That was how Sparta worked. Your personal feelings always yielded to the greater good. A Spartan boy might attend his own father's funeral without shedding a single tear. Not because he lacked feeling, but because he had been taught that a warrior's death was not tragedy, it was validation. Spartan children learned this early. Emotion was weakness. Weakness was dangerous. Crying too loudly? Forbidden. Tearing your tunic in despair? Excessive. Throwing yourself onto the ground at the sight of the coffin? absolutely unacceptable. These weren't expressions of love, they were failures in discipline. And failure had no place in Sparta. Women who had lost sons in battle might grieve quietly at night, but in public they would beam with pride. There are stories of mothers closing their doors on sons who returned alive but not victorious. Because in Sparta, survival wasn't always a win. Honor was. In fact, losing a son in combat could elevate a mother's standing. Keeping one alive who had fled could ruin it. It was an inversion of values that shocked outsiders, but in Sparta, grief became glory. You didn't mourn a death, you celebrated the courage it took to earn it. The name on a gravestone wasn't placed there for sentiment, it was an instruction, a message to future Spartans. This is how you serve your city. A soldier who died in battle, a woman who died giving birth, those were the names carved in stone. And every passerby was meant to memorize and emulate. But not all deaths earned that reverence. Cowardice wasn't just a phalange, it was an infection, one that could spread from a single man to an entire battalion. That's why Sparta had a word for such people: tremblers. Men who shook with fear instead of standing their ground. And what awaited them wasn't just shame, was erasure. Tremblers were marked publicly. No quiet forgiveness. They wore patchwork cloaks made from mismatched colors, screaming their disgrace with every step. Their beards were shaved down one side, half man, half humiliation. No more seats at festivals, no more marriages, no respect, no redemption. They became shadows in their own homes, exiles without leaving the city. Their names, if spoken at all, were spat like curses. And if they died, no shield carried them, no cloth wrapped them. Just a body in the dirt, if even that. Sparta might bury them, but not because it cared. It did it to get rid of them. Strategic retreat in a larger battle plan? That was different. But saving your own skin at the expense of your brothers? Unforgivable. You didn't just betray the army. You betrayed your ancestors, your mother, your name. And your name, after that, meant nothing. Some mothers are said to have slammed the door on sons who returned home, alive but dishonored. Imagine that, closing the door on your own child, not because they died, but because they failed to die with honor. Brutal, yes, but in Sparta, honor didn't bend, not even for blood. If your son's cowardice stained your family's legacy, you bore that stain too. It followed you to market. It whispered behind your back at festivals. Your bloodline was marked. And Sparta remembered. Always. That's why everything in Sparta was built around the idea that you didn't just live for yourself, you lived for the city. And if you failed in that, Sparta would forget you ever existed. Even in how they buried their dead, this was clear. While Athens built elaborate tombs and Egypt raised pyramids that touched the sky, Sparta kept things plain, intentionally stark. Even the burial grounds told a story. No intricate carvings, no lavish inscriptions, no grand displays to weep before. The simplicity wasn't an oversight, it was a message. Your actions were your monument, nothing more, nothing less. And yet within that austerity lived an immense, unspeakable power. A warrior carried on his shield, he had done everything Sparta ever asked of him. A woman wrapped in the shroud she wove, she had given the city not just her life, but its future. There was no greater gift, no higher calling, no louder legacy. If this story is resonating with you, if you feel the weight of that kind of dedication and discipline, subscribe or follow the channel. Because we're far from done uncovering the truths Sparta tried to carve into stone. They didn't believe in building statues for the dead. No marble angels, no golden tombs. In Sparta, the dead spoke for themselves, rather, their lives did. The only thing carved in stone was a name. And that name, it had to be earned. Through blood, through pain, through ultimate, uncompromising service. When a Spartan died, they weren't laid to rest beneath towering columns or wreathed in perfume. They were placed in the earth outside the city walls, in humble, quiet cemeteries that looked more like forgotten fields than sacred ground. These weren't decorated places. No mosaics, no columns. Just soil, wind, and memory. It wasn't about where you were buried. It was about how you had lived. Most Spartans were given no stone, no plaque, not even a marker, just a shallow grave, unadorned, and anonymous. That might sound cruel, but in Sparta, it was purposeful. The city didn't worship the individual, it worshipped the collective. And so, unless your death had directly served the state, your name wasn't etched into history. It was folded into the group and kept there, quietly. There were only two exceptions to this rule. If you died clutching your spear in battle, or if you died giving birth to the next generation of warriors, your name earned the stone. Just a name, maybe, a small symbol. No poetry, no statues of lions or gods. And yet, that little stone was everything. It was a signal. This person mattered. Not for who they were, but for what they gave. Spartan burial was less about death and more about duty. Historians have argued that this bare-bones approach wasn't accidental, it was ideological. In Athens or Thebes, the afterlife was a theatre. You'd see ornate tombs, burning incense, mourners with faces streaked in ash. But Sparta had no time for theatrics. The dead didn't need ceremony. Their legacy would be carried not in marble, but in memory. The dead weren't worshipped, they were remembered. Through stories, yes. But more importantly, through imitation. You honored a fallen warrior not by crying, but by becoming one. You respected a woman who died in childbirth not with weeping, but by raising your children with the same fierce pride she showed in bearing hers. In Sparta, mourning wasn't loud, it was lived. These burial sites weren't just graveyards. They were daily reminders, quiet testaments to what it cost to build and protect a city like Sparta. No one visited these places to wallow. They visited to reflect, to internalize. Every unmarked grave whispered, "The city comes first." And every named grave thundered, "This one gave it all." The communal nature of Spartan death was a mirror of Spartan life. In battle, no man fought alone. Shields locked, bodies aligned, hearts beating for a shared cause. In death, they returned to the same ground, side by side, no one above the other. Egalitarian, even in the grave. That's why extravagant funerals were not just discouraged, they were forbidden. Mourning had rules. You didn't get to scream in the streets or rip your tunic open in despair. That kind of drama? That was for softer cities. In Sparta, discipline didn't die when the body did. It extended straight into the grave. The message was clear and unwavering. Glory fades, but service is forever. The loudest cry wasn't from a mourner. It was the silence of a Spartan graveyard, where the absence of decoration was the presence of purpose. Other ancient cultures celebrated the dead with grandeur. But in Sparta, it was the living impact that mattered. Not the gold left behind, but the grit you gave while alive. Funerals weren't moments to glorify the soul. They were checkpoints, where your life was assessed. Did you serve Sparta? Did you stand your ground? Did you leave more behind than you took? Excessive mourning was considered indulgent, weak, a break in the wall of discipline that kept Sparta standing. Even grief had a timer. A few days. Quiet. Personal. Then you moved on. Because Sparta needed the living to carry the torch, not cradle the ashes. And yet, remembrance in Sparta wasn't cold. It was deep. Warriors who fell in battle were celebrated in songs and poems, not carved into stone, but woven into the voice of the city. Their stories were passed around fires, shared in training grounds, and burned into the memory of young boys sharpening their first blades. These weren't just war stories, they were manuals for living. A mother might mention a fallen son's name while preparing a meal. A commander might point to a gravestone and say, "That man didn't run." And just like that, the dead were teaching again. Women who died in childbirth were remembered just as fiercely. Their names whispered with reverence, not for their fragility, but for their sacrifice. They were seen not as victims, but as warriors who fell in a different kind of battle, and their deaths were never in vain. Spartan women weren't background characters in this drama. They were the infrastructure, the bridge between birth and battlefield. Their deaths were symbols of continuity, of the price required to keep the warrior machine alive. And that's the genius of Spartan remembrance. It wasn't about the individual, it was about reinforcing the values that kept the state whole. Sacrifice, endurance, strength. That's why the memorials were subtle. Because they weren't just about who died, they were about what they died for. At annual festivals, the city would pause not to weep but to reflect. Names of the honored dead were spoken aloud, not with sorrow, but with pride. Young boys looked up, knowing those names could be theirs one day. Girls listened and understood that motherhood was not just nurturing, it was national service. Even education was shaped by this mindset. Spartan boys weren't taught to fear death, they were taught to earn it, to understand that a glorious death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of eternal memory. And that memory lived on not in statues or scripts, but in the choices others made because of it. To modern eyes, it might all seem brutal, cold, but in truth it was clarity. A system built to strip away ego and root identity in something larger than oneself. In a city like Sparta, death didn't end your story. It made you legend, but only if you'd lived with enough courage to deserve it. Because here, mourning didn't linger. But memory? Memory became immortal. And that's what makes this chapter of history so chilling, so powerful, and so unforgettable. If you felt the weight of this story, if you want more tales of ancient worlds that burned with purpose, follow or subscribe the channel. You won't want to miss what comes next.